thing about the stories that we've got is that they were written down years after the event, and they were written down after they had been passed among many people, and we don't even have them in the first language. That we do think there was something real to it. We really do think there was something real to it. But there are undoubtedly mythical elements within the story. It's how come we know it has become mythological, folklore, urban legend kind of thing. Stories get optimized in the retelling. People pick out the good bits, the bits that are passable. People really did believe in fairies too. So that means something about people. It doesn't mean we have to believe in them now, but it does mean something about the way human beings work in their heads. Well, thanks for joining us this evening. This is really nice. It's a subject I really like. As Christian said, I've made a series of videos, so I've spent quite a bit of time on it and really, really enjoyed it. It's the Green Children of Woolpit, and these two green children turned up in a Sussex village in the 11th century. Now, we have two sources for it. That's what makes it interesting. If it was just one person, you would think, well, you know, all right, it was a story, it was a fantasy, whatever. But there are two people who write very completely independent accounts of this, and they live in very different parts of the country. The styles are very different, but there's enough that's similar for us to be absolutely sure they're referring to the same thing. The first one was a guy called Ralph of Coggeshall. He was a Cistercian monk and then a Cistercian abbot at Coggeshall Abbey. And this is one of the things I was so lucky when I went to Coggeshall. I first of all did a video about a witch there, but there's a bit of the abbey still survives south of the village, and the house was being sold or was kind of between tenants at the time, so I was able to wander around it a bit. The person taking care of it let me have a look, and so I was lucky enough to be able to see part of the house which remains from the abbey, and this is it from the outside. The rest of the house is a bit newer, still very old, centuries old, but this you can see it's got sort of Norman architecture. It's got a Norman arch there to the right, and this is part of the cloister, and all those windows above probably provided ventilation to the daughter or dormitory. So it may well be that Ralph of Coggeshall himself actually stayed there, or stayed in that particular building. He was certainly from this site, so this was in the cloister itself. I was very happy to be able to get in there, and it's in the videos. Now, the second person who was writing was William of Newburgh, or William Parvus, and he was from Yorkshire. So he was a good 150, probably 200 miles away, and he was from a different order of monks. So we know that they were separate, and they write these two different kinds of styles, so they're probably not deriving one from the other. In fact, there's a lot of reason to think that this story was just around at the time and that they were the two people who wrote it down. It was kind of like an urban legend of its day. By that, I don't mean that it was made up. I mean that it was a story which went contagiously from one person to another. Something that we should remember is that these are two different men writing this, and they're writing in Latin, and the accounts that we get from the Green Children themselves, or perhaps from the girl, were written down years after the effect, and they were written down by third or fourth parties. So we really do, this isn't a first person account at all. This is a story which has been kind of optimized in the retelling. In general, there are details from both sides, but in general, a boy and a girl emerged from a pit. They couldn't speak English, and they were wearing unrecognizable clothes. They were green, and they were taken to a local house, and for a while they wouldn't eat bread. They would only eat beans. The boy died. We don't know if he kind of recovered and spoke English or if he died very quickly, but he was the one he appears to be younger. He was a bit weaker. But the girl did survive. They both account the children recovering their proper colour from eating properly. So it's interesting that we've probably later thought that there are all sorts of meanings to the colour green, whereas they did attribute it to diet, Ralph and William. They learned to speak English, and they say that they came from a twilight land. They were, in one account, they were herding animals and they entered a cavern and then came out into this world and couldn't get back. One of them, in one of the accounts, they were attracted by the sound of bells. So this isn't a completely exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea that there is a difference between the accounts. Ralph had them found at the mouth of a pit, and William had them wandering through a cave. Ralph had them taken to a local nobleman called Sir Richard de Calne, and William had them in Woolpit for a while first. Ralph had the girl baptized, William had them both being baptized, and William mentions that they come from something called St. Martin's Land and that they were Christian. That was probably referring to St. Martin of Tours, who was quite popular on the continent, but known over here as well. And it isn't mentioned by Ralph. So that's not an exhaustive list. If you want an exhaustive list, you have to buy this book, which, and the details will come up later. It's a very, very good book by a man named John Clark, and he goes through this in quite a lot of detail. But this evening, I just want to make you aware that there are differences. However, the stories are the same on so many details that we know they're talking about the same thing. So the timing, when did this happen? Well, we can kind of work it out, really. William of Newburgh, we know that he was 1136 to 1198, I think. So that was his lifetime, and we know when he lived. He wrote that this happened at the end of King Stephen's reign, and we know that King Stephen reigned until 1154. I don't know if you know much about Plantagenet history, but basically Stephen was he was an intruder king. He jumped in and kind of just jumped in there at the right time. The throne had been left to a woman named Empress Matilda, and in the end it was her son Henry II who ended up taking the kingship, because Stephen's oldest son died, and there was just nothing he could do with the family that he had intended to settle onto the throne. But this caused a sort of 20-year civil war in England that seriously affected everybody. This wasn't just the aristocrats fighting amongst each other. This was actually very unpleasant, and it affected everybody. So we know when King Stephen died, that was 1154. Ralph of Coggeshall, we know he died after 1227. So his life did overlap William of Newburgh, and that is how we know that this story must have been kind of ambient for both of their lifetimes. We don't know when Ralph of Coggeshall actually was born, but we do know that he was on the Third Crusade, which was 1189 to 1193, 92. It was the one that Richard the Lionheart was on. And so in order for him to have been an abbot by the time he was writing in the 1120s, and for him to have died of old age after 1127, and to have been on a crusade and been an adult by the time he got there, I've kind of guessed that the latest he could have been born was 1165. May well have been 10 or 20 years earlier than that, but everybody's just guessing really with this. And we know that Sir Richard de Calne, who he claims to have known personally and who personally passed the story on to him, we know his lifespan. So, and we know that he and Ralph overlapped quite a bit. So that's good, that's safe. Now, you can see on this map that Woolpit is kind of towards the bottom of the map there. These distances aren't particularly huge. Bury St Edmunds, you can walk to Bury St Edmunds in a day from Woolpit, and you can see directly north Wicks in Bardwell, and that is where Richard de Calne came from. So it is believable that de Calne and Ralph of Coggeshall knew each other. Bardwell is a parish. It's still a parish. It's still a very interesting church. I went there to see where it's a bit disputed. That there's now a vineyard there, Wicks Vineyard, and a lot of people think that this is where de Calne was, and there's evidence of two old buildings, two prestigious buildings having been there. Unfortunately, one of them was the earthworks to do with it were flattened in the 70s or 80s, which is, I mean, it's criminal really. They hold festivals on it now, but just to think that they could have had that archaeology if they hadn't flattened it fairly recently. But anyway, so this cluster of geographical places does make it plausible that Ralph got his information from Richard de Calne. And you can see Coggeshall is just to the south there, and Woolpit is where the children came from. And the reason I took a picture of the interior of Bardwell Church was because it still has some medieval images. All churches had this in medieval times, and then they were, after the Reformation, or more specifically sort of 17th century, they were quite often whitewashed, gone over or destroyed. But there are a few of them which have been peeled back and you can just see a bit. So this is in the video. I was quite thrilled to be able to see some of these. And we know that the girl who was the Green Child of Woolpit was still alive in 1198. So if she had been 10 in 1154, that would have put her in her 50s. That's still totally plausible. She could have lived into her 50s. I think everybody thinks everybody died when they were 22 in medieval times, but actually you could survive to the same age that we do if you avoided contagious disease and if you avoided death in childbirth, which was statistically unlikely if you're a woman. But you know, women did. I think the death rate was something like 1 in 10 or something. So we don't know when she died, but I've kind of assumed that if she was 10 at the end of Stephen's reign when she was found, then she would have been born 1145-ish. So all of these dates kind of, you know, cohere. Then they would have been discovered. And King Henry was from 1154 to 1189. And King Henry is one of my favourite kings. Doesn't seem like he was a very nice man, actually, but he was a very effective man, and he was actually interested in his job, and he was a good king. So the thing about this story is that we do think there was something real to it. We really do think there was something real to it. But there are undoubtedly mythical elements within the story. It's how come we know it has become mythological, folklore, urban legend kind of thing. Stories get optimized in the retelling. People pick out the good bits, the bits that are passable onto other people, the ideas that are contagious, if you like. And there's this one theme here of them having come from underground. I'll go quickly through three stories, three 12th century stories, which all use this theme. So it kind of gives us the idea of what people were trying to get at. The first one was a story written by Gerald of Wales about Eladir, and he went into the side of a mountain and met some people, and they were all very nice, and they were incredibly honest and sort of marvelous morals and things like that. But his mother persuaded him to steal something from there as a souvenir one day. He stole a golden ball, and the people ran after him. He didn't manage to actually get the golden ball out of the land. Obviously, they were very unhappy with him. And when he went back to try and get back in there, the doorway wasn't available. He couldn't find it. So he had been shut out of this place. It was, so you've got this underground land with another race of people. They're very virtuous, and he has been shut out for being immoral. You've also got the story of King Hurler, which you may have heard of because he's quite an icon in relation to the Wild Hunt. He probably derives actually from Odin and the Wild Hunt. You've got the name living through to to supernatural beings like Harlequin, or the Hela hunt. And the idea with him was that he met somebody from underground, and the guy from underground invited him to his wedding. Herla went with all of his friends, and he was very well taken care of, catered for at the wedding. And then he was like, okay, thanks very much. Now I'll leave. And the guy who got married gave him a little hunting dog and said, don't dismount from your horse until the dog dismounts. So he left the cave, got on his horses with his men, and the dog just wouldn't dismount. So a couple of his company got impatient, and they got down, and then they disappeared into ash. Herla understood what the significance of this was. They met a man, and they said, oh, have you heard of King Herla? And the guy said, oh, no, that was from centuries ago. So the idea was that there was an unnatural passage of time in this land, and there is an unnatural passage of time in fairyland, in most fairy stories. So the idea is that King Herla is still wandering around with this dog under his arm, and he hasn't been able to dismount yet. And there's another one from Gervase of Tilbury. Ralph of Coleshaw knew Gervase of Tilbury, and he told a story about a man who went looking for his animal in a cave. His swine ran into a cave, ran through, and he ended up in another world. It was a different world, and the world was at the opposite season to him. So it was kind of like a fairyland through a cave. So we see that this kind of underground parallel world, this other world, is quite a theme in medieval stories. The only problem is Sussex is as flat as a pancake. This doesn't seem to be a story which is at home in this terrain, because it is very flat. If this was in Derbyshire or something like that, you'd go, oh yeah, I can see that happening. But there aren't caves here. So you know that there are some displaced themes from the Green Children of Woolpit story. I should point out, actually, that Woolpit is possibly named after wolf pits. Might not be, but it's thought to be named after pits that were used to catch wolves. But the place was in the 17th century. It was mined as well. They were busy digging pits and ditches for all sorts of things. So it may well be that whatever we have remaining might be down to that, although there are some ditches that have got Roman remains at the bottom of them. They're not ditches anymore. They now have great lines of trees. So the idea that the children could have come from a pit makes sense, that they could have sort of walked into a ditch or a pit and then been found coming out. But the idea that they came through a cave it doesn't fit the terrain. The other mythic elements that we've got, the really clear one, is the Babes in the Wood one. And this illustration is by Randolph Caldecott. So this is 19th century, fairly clearly. It's a very recent illustration. But the story was first written down in the 16th century. So this is probably a kind of a very, it's a resounding theme. It's a story that's been around for a very long time. And the other mythic element that I was interested in was the food. The idea that the children rejected our food. They rejected, the way one of the chroniclers put it was, until they discovered the use of bread. It was like they didn't know what to do with bread. And what they did was, when somebody came past with beans, they went, ooh, ooh, and showed that they wanted to eat them. They broke into the stalks rather than the pods of the beans and got unhappy, but somebody showed them how to get into the pods. So they only ate beans until they learned the use of bread. That was the phrase that was used. Now, at that point in history, they would have been fava beans, broad beans. They were the only beans that were naturalized in this country. We've got all sorts of ones now from all over the place. But at that point in history, if you were eating beans, it was broad beans. So these children had an issue with food. And you see this very often in fairy stories and with all sorts of supernatural stories, because if you eat something from another land, you're kind of ingesting the essence of it. if you like. So it means that somehow you're taking that part of that world into you. And it seems to be that this is symbolic in this story because those children from another land are taking part of our world into them. And it means that they stay. So I'll go through a couple of stories just to um, give you an indication. There's the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, and he ended up spending some time in fairyland and becoming a gifted poet because he was influenced by fairyland. And he went in there and he was about to pluck some fruit and eat it. And the Queen of Fairyland, who was his hostess, warned him not to. She actually ended up providing him with refreshment. But he was warned that it was very dangerous if he was going to eat the food that he was provided with. He spent time there, he became a poet, and he was given the gift of prophecy. But it's very clear that he shouldn't partake of the food of fairyland. There was some danger associated with it. From the Legends of Ireland, this was a 19th century version by Lady Wilde. And in this version, this woman saw a group of people around a bonfire, and she went up there and people were dancing and they were happy. And she was invited underneath a hill through a tunnel, into a cave. And she was hosted by this man and she was offered food, but somebody walked by her and said, "Don't eat the food or you'll never be able to leave." So she avoided the food and she ended up running away, grabbing a sprig of ivy. We don't know if ivy was potent, if it was a kind of a herb that would protect her against the fairies, or if it was just that she managed to get away before she ate the food. But the warning was very clear, it was very explicit. You don't eat the food in fairyland. And the other one, this is one of my favourite ones. This is The Fairy Dwelling in Selina Moor, and this was collected by William Bottrell, again 19th century. And with this, a man got lost on a moor. Excuse me, just need to get some tea. And he saw he saw a dwelling in the distance, went to the dwelling, saw that there was festivals and not hostilities. People were sort of being were eating and having a party and all this kind of thing, and so he was wandering around. People were eating, people were playing music, and somebody grabbed him and took him out of the back to where there was some trees, an orchard, and she said, "Don't eat any of the food." And he recognized her as his fiancée, who had died a few years earlier. In fact, he had seen her, she had died, she'd been put into a coffin and she'd been put under the ground. She was gone. But it turns out she had been kidnapped by the fairies and she was being used as a servant by them. I don't know if you follow fairy folklore at all, but there's something called a stock in fairy folklore, which is where when a fairy takes a changeling, they will exchange their changeling for a child, and they'll make the stock look like your child, except it will be ravenous. It would just take everything from you. So by means of using this kind of magic, they made this woman look as though she had a corpse, but actually she wasn't. She was serving them in fairyland. So similar kind of thing. He ended up escaping by not eating the food. So we've got this not communing with the food. A lot of these stories, incidentally, have the kind of parallel idea that that fairyland is the land of the dead. And it's certainly a strand of thought. It's one of my favorite ones, that this is one of the places that the idea of the fairies come from, is a pagan idea of the dead. It's natural for religions all over the world to have relations with the dead. It's very difficult just when somebody dies to just sort of kick them in a gully and go, "Oh, well, they've gone." The thought that somebody has actually gone, the idea that somebody remains with you, that they're disembodied, that you can talk to them, that they might be able to help you, is so intrinsic to most religious thought, well, to all religious traditions, that it would be surprising if it wasn't part of what has turned into our fairy folklore. So we get that with these stories too. So going on to the bit about the children being green. Now, they were both agreed that it was temporary. And in fact, probably subsequent writers have got a bit more mystical about this whole thing than we have. They both attributed it to diet. At last, as the nature of our food prevailed, they gradually changed their colour and became like us. So both of our chroniclers thought that it was something to do with diet or health. John Clark, one of the main things that he's done, well, actually, he's the scholar for this. I mean, he's collected so much over the years, but he's pointed out that the color was dyed instead of tinted. So he feels that it was a very profound color. It wasn't just a kind of green around the gill type colors. He talks about prasinum, which is leek. He feels like it was a leek color, you know, like a deep green. There was a condition called chlorosis. It used to be called chlorosis. It's iron deficiency anemia. So if you're iron deficient and you have a certain kind of a skin color, then the undertones of your skin can end up looking a little bit green. But this is a bit green around the gills. This isn't profoundly green. Chlorosis is what iron deficiency anemia was called as recently as the Victorian era, and people in East Anglia of that era would have recognised iron deficiency chlorosis for what it was, really. So the thought that these kids were just very, very mildly green in a funny light seems to be odd, because you would think that they would have seen an awful lot more of this than they appear to have. And then there's also another theory which has been suggested, which is that they were suffering from arsenic poisoning. And it appears that the reason that people think that arsenic makes you go green is because of the Paris green tint in the 19th century. It was used for wallpaper colorings, that kind of thing. But it doesn't actually make people green, it makes people kind of grey and patchy. So, what were they? What were the Green Children? Well, for many centuries, people didn't talk about them. In fact, we can kind of tell that this was that mythology, that urban legend that was written down by two chroniclers and then kind of left for a few centuries. But what is reckoned to be sort of the first sort of science fiction novel was published in the 17th century, and it was mentioned that they might have been from the moon. So I mean, we've got the sort of the little green men idea. Could it have originally come from there, or is that something that's just come after the 1940s and ETs have become more fashionable? Who knows? There's also the idea that they may have been fairies or elves, and the word fairy took over from elf in sort of like the late 14th century. In the late 14th century, English took over from Anglo-Norman as the kind of language of the upper classes. It was to do with the wars with the French and after the Black Death, and there were so many political kinds of reasons for this to have happened. But Chaucer, for example, wrote in English, probably first generation to have written for the upper classes in English. So they started to use a French-derived word instead of the more Scandinavian Germanic-derived word elf, which were probably similar kinds of supernatural creatures. So were they fairies or elves? Well, I mean, we may well have got that from the idea that that fairies are green. As far as we know, applying the colour of green to fairies started sort of happening sort of 16th century. So going back as far as the 12th, they might have been wearing green clothes, but they weren't really. They certainly weren't green-skinned. There was a classification of fairies into black and red and white and green in the 16th century. They each had different characteristics. So this idea that fairies are green is quite a bit later, and post-dates what Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were doing. So this is something that we've probably back projected onto the Green Children of Woolpit. The other idea, I think this one was suggested by Paul Harris. This was another very good article. I enjoyed this article. And what he was trying to do was to kind of get a bit rational about this. All of the discussion about the Green Children of Woolpit had been a bit, had been very folklore, a bit sort of up in the air. What he was suggesting was that these children had been the children of Flemish immigrants and that they had accidentally fallen into some dye, or that they had dyed themselves to blend into the background, into the forest. Well, it's not as daft as it sounds, because there were a lot of Flemish immigrants in the Low Counties facing the continent. The biggest industry, or one of the biggest industries, was wool and fabric. English wool was known as the best wool, and Flemish weavers were known as the best weavers. So there was an immigrant population of a lot of Flemings, and Flemish was a very well-spoken language. Very widely spoken language, certainly would have been recognised. So we have a population there, and Harris mentioned about a specific event, the Battle of Fornham in the 1170s. King Henry II was a very effective ruler, but I don't think he was a very nice person. I don't think he was a very good dad. Or, having said that, actually, his oldest son was also a bit spoiled. So what they did, they did a habit that they were in the habit of doing on the continent, which is that he crowned his son when he was still alive, in order that his son was the young king. He was Henry the Young King. And the idea was it was to avoid a succession war. You kind of promoted him to a junior position while you were still alive, and then he would slowly take over. And by the time you died, he would already have been king. But Henry and his brothers wanted an awful lot more authority. They felt that their father just controlled them too much, and they actually broke out in a complete war with him. And one of the key dates on that was the Battle of Fornham in the 1170s. And you can see on the map here, before I've shown you Woolpit, Wixon, Bardwell, Bury St Edmunds, just to the northwest you can see Fornham here. And there were a lot of Flemish mercenaries. King Henry II ended up winning this. And the young Henry did survive, but he ended up dying before Henry II died. So he never did become the main king. But at the Battle of Fornham, there were lots of Flemish mercenaries. So Harris suggested that the kind of murderous rampage that broke out after Fornham extended to the Fleming civilians. The Flemish mercenaries were murdered, but were killed. I mean, it was a battle. I suppose it was open season for everybody. They were killed by the locals, the farmers, when the battle had been won, and these Flemish mercenaries were sort of running across the river, but they all ended up being killed. And so Harris suggested that this spilt over to the civilians, and that these children were part of the civilian weaving families, and that in order to escape, their parents had sort of died to blend into the background, and that their parents didn't survive, but they did. So they were speaking Flemish. They had been dyed with a fabric dye, and they had sort of walked to Woolpit, which they could have done from Fornham easily. And I really like the idea that he's trying to bring a really seriously rational element to all of this. John Clark isn't quite so keen on the idea, and it's right. I'll get back to this. And I know what he means. The timing sort of doesn't work out. There is no record whatsoever that civilian Flemings were involved in this. There's a lot of records that the Flemish mercenaries were killed, but that was the limit of it. It stayed on the battlefield. The other thing that I go into in a bit more detail on videos is that dyeing something green with natural dyes is actually quite hard. You have to do it in two stages. The first pass is a dye with woad, and woad produces a kind of a blue dye, and then you have to put a yellow wash on it afterwards. So the thought of just dipping your kids once in this green dye, we didn't have dyes like that till the 19th century with azo dyes. So it kind of doesn't really work out. did they come from further afield? Now, I've wondered this. John Clarke's gone into this. John Clarke has gone into this with potentially with the kids being Jewish, because there was a Jewish population. You can see we've got it back here at Bury St Edmunds. In fact, there was a pogrom on Bury St Edmunds in the 1190s. There were various Jewish pogroms from that time onwards, usually just to nickel their, just to nick all their money, frankly. They were forbidden from belonging to guilds and things like that, from making money in more conventional ways in medieval British cities. So they were confined to money lending. So, if you could get away with killing them, you could become very wealthy. So we have wondered whether or not it was possibly the fact that the kids were Jewish, that they had a kind of an undertone, a more sort of a different undertone to their skin, where if they had iron deficiency, anemia, they could look a bit green, possibly. But the other thing that John Clarke has mentioned is that there is a genetic trait in Eastern Europe. I've actually spoken with a Turkish friend of mine about this as well, and the Levant, where you can be allergic to beans, severely allergic to beans. Now, it's an X-related trait, which means that the girl might not have had it, or she might have only suffered very mildly. But if the boy was XY and he did have this trait, then he could have been made very, very severely ill by having fava beans. So there's a possibility, I suppose. I have suggested, it's only a very light suggestion, it's kind of unlikely given the Crusades going on at the time, that they also could have been Muslim and that they were refusing to eat for dietary reasons. But Ramadan didn't occur at the right time of year for this. Both of our chroniclers are very clear that the children turned up at harvest time. So this is kind of July, August, and Ramadan wasn't the right time of year. And also Muslims don't make children fast. So the idea that they were somehow sticking to a rigorous diet for religious reasons, it's a possibility. We don't know. We just don't know. Favism, I've mentioned that. If you have broad beans and you have this trait, it's something that in Turkey and Syria and Iraq and places like this, people are still very, very careful about, because it's a very common trait. So broadly, these are the two books, if you want to follow this up, and people who I've been very lucky enough to interview in my series. The Green Children of Woolpit by John Clarke. Unfortunately, it's an academic book, so it is expensive, but it's well worth the read. And the other thing is, I was very lucky to get interviews with Twilight of the Godlings, who you may well have heard of, Francis Young. He's very knowledgeable about the development of fairy folklore in this country. So get both of those books. They're incredibly good. If you can't get the academic book, fair enough, it is expensive. Have a look at my video series. I kind of go over the same stories in less depth, and I have interviews with John and Francis. To summarise, what do we know about the Green Children of Woolpit? Not a lot. We can theorise, we can come up with all these ideas about how these stories are consistent with other kinds of stories at the time, how they have a mythological significance that may well be partly lost on us, that may well have fitted more into their own time than in present time. But everybody really seems to think, and I think too, that something did happen. There were two orphaned green children that came along, and they ended up being looked after. One of them died and one of them survived. And this is a mysterious story. They're probably not fairies. It would be nice if they were, wouldn't it? But they probably aren't. So please do remember to follow me on social media if you follow any of that, because it would be good to keep in touch with you, and have a look at the videos at your leisure. Thank you very much.
But we have an ask of you. We ask that you hit the like button here. We ask that you hit the subscribe button. Now, the reason is, for you it is just a moment, but for us it really helps the algorithm find our content and other people find what really is deeply interesting to them. I've been aware of this tale for quite some time, and I've often wondered about how stories translate and how they are updated over time, and they almost become a different story along the way. In the take here, this goes back to the 1100s. I mean, are there any other similar stories that are effectively updated versions or other takes on the same story of the Children of Woolpit, where they're almost like branching versions of it? Have you come across any of those?
I haven't actually. I've come across lots of stories where somebody is going to fairyland, and it's quite clearly fairyland. Fairyland is underground, and that's what makes us think that it's associated with ancestors, because it might well have been quite often a misunderstanding of what Bronze Age burial pit was. Um, and yeah, no, I haven't, and it's funny the fact that they are green, and we have projected this fairy kind of theme onto them, which probably wasn't all that high in the mix at the time. I mean, it's a good time for stories. The 12th century, 12th and 13th century is a great time for chroniclers. I mean, there's loads of them: William of Malmesbury, Gervase of Tilbury, and Walter Map, and all these people were writing down these stories, but they were Anglo-Norman. They were writing in Anglo-Norman or Latin, and there was probably a very, very different vernacular culture going on underneath them, because William the Conqueror pretty comprehensively substituted the ruling population of England at the time. So there will be this vernacular folklore, which probably comes out in Chaucer's tales a bit later on, and yeah. So the thing that you mentioned about the stories, kind of, the way they all came out, is we have to remember is that there were several social classes separated by language. There were more languages than we speak now. Flemish would have been recognisable. I mean, this is another reason to think that the children aren't Flemish, is because even if people didn't speak Flemish, they would recognise the sound of it. And Jewish people spoke Anglo-Norman. There was potentially sort of Norse-derived languages spoken. There was Middle English being spoken. So it was a very, very mixed kind of a society. And every time we get a story, it's passed from one group of people to another. So all of the rough edges get sanded off. Not to mention that William of Newburgh, he said he thought this was a very unlikely story. He wasn't going to write it down, but he heard it from so many reliable people. So he heard it from, it was going around, it was doing the rounds. And every time it gets passed from one person to another, it changes. I get Ralph of Coggeshall was kind of our primary source because he said he knew Richard de Calne. But Ralph of Coggeshall is the more mystical of the two writers. He's the one who includes all of the kind of the fairy optimizations, all of the mythological optimizations. So this is a created story. This is not, this isn't written by eyewitnesses, and it isn't even written in the first language.
Wow, it's incredible. And the fact that it almost survived in its original version, would you say, or how much do you think has been changed? Because it doesn't sound like much has changed from then to now, other than the language.
Not a lot has changed from then to now, because we have the original chroniclers' versions. Okay. We've got Ralph and William's versions, and the story disappeared. So, as I say, probably, it started to sort of come back with the Man in the Moon in the, what was his name? Archbishop Godwin, I think, in the 17th century. So we do have the original versions for the 12th century, but that doesn't mean that was actually an original version. It was written in a second language. It was passed around for decades before it was written down, and it has been optimized.
Okay, I understand. So your passion for dark folklore, I mean, where did that come from, really? What was the first stories that you read? What made me go, this is something I'm so passionate about that I'm almost going to make it my profession?
I just always been interested. I mean, my family, on my mum's side, they believed in ghosts and poltergeists and mediums and all this kind of stuff. And I just remember sitting slack-jawed with horror at all of the various allegedly true events that they were telling me about. And I learnt about werewolves, and they terrified the life out of me. Uh, and I just, it just always gave me this kind of dark frisson, if you like. And I stopped being scared because I didn't believe in any of them. But I still thought it was well, it's great for entertainment. So um, I just like watching horror movies. Who doesn't? But in addition, I thought that people studied religion very seriously, and people really do believe in religion. Well, people really did believe in fairies too. So that means something about people. It doesn't mean we have to believe in them now, but it does mean something about the way human beings work in their heads. The fact that people, honest to God, believed in vampires, they honest to God believed in werewolves, they honest to God believed in poltergeists, all these things that to me, I thought that was as fascinating. It's like religious studies. And religious studies was my favourite subject at school. We did comparative religion rather than sort of, worshipping religion. And I just thought, the anthropology, the history, the psychology, everything was just absolutely fascinating.
It is. I mean, I often find folklore and the stories of ghosts to be as rich as,
Oh, yeah.
for
Well,
sure.
that's the thing. And for a long time, it wasn't respectable. And then, really, I interviewed Sue Blackmore for The Skeptic once. And Sue Blackmore was somebody who was a parapsychologist, did her PhD, trying to prove all sorts of things, telekinesis and all kinds of things. And she started out as a believer, but she did a PhD, testing all sorts of theories, and she came up with sort of null results, which, of course, as you all know, are results. All right, that means that you've taken you've conducted good experiments to find out that telekinesis, for example, doesn't exist, or psychic powers or whatever. And at the time, I said to her in the interview, I said, "Oh, how did you decide you were going to make this into a respectable profession?" And she said, "How dare you? I haven't had a respectable profession." And of course, at the time, she hadn't. She was one of the people who made it respectable, who made studying this kind of stuff a worthy thing. Even if you talk to Chris French, he'll say that at the time that he was doing his PhD and everything like that, he was interested in the anomalistic psychology strand. But everybody at that time who was doing that kind of thing was urged to have it as a second string to their bow. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a respectable uh, profile, professional profile. And that has changed so much. I mean, you think about people like Francesca Stavrakopoulos, who has studied biblical literature, who's studied the Bible, and she isn't religious, but she's fascinated from the Bible from an historical point of view. And so and she incidentally she ends up her profession is really dominated by people who are religious, and they have a religious agenda that they are very concerned with. So people like that have, over the years, started to make it more respectable. But it was just thought of as frivolous. God is respectable and fairies are frivolous. That was just the way it was.
And you've switched it around.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I'm doing my bit.
Okay, before I hand over to Caroline for the questions that I've been gathering in our chat box here for the people who have gathered here this evening, I really find the concept of is it St Martin's Land really intriguing
Mm,
because I've had an interest in the people who have the experiences with abductions in terms of the alien abduction phenomenon, and a
mhm.
lot of their stories have a lot of those elements that are found within that. They come from a land, they often go underground, or there's an emergence of people, or they've gone somewhere and they can't eat something, or they can't have something, or they try and take something away. That kind of story fits very familiarly, if there's such a word, into the abduction phenomena, or
Yeah,
those who've had some kind of strange anomalistic journey where they disappear and come back. And I mean, how do you think a lot of those kind of cases are almost like these children here, where they've emerged from somewhere? Do you think that is a continuation of the same folklore?
It seems there certainly seem to be conspicuous similarities, don't there? And I think an awful lot of folklore has got to do with sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming and out of body experiences. I don't know if any of you guys have had out of body experiences. I've had many, 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 loads of lucid dreaming as well.
Yes.
And something if you go into those experiences is if you start out with sleep paralysis, you can practice and get to lucid dreaming. Also, that there are certain themes to do with these kind of alternate experiences. Going through a tunnel is one of them. It's one of the most basic, and also near-death experiences. So the thought that you're going through a tunnel and you emerge into another world, I think, is probably neurological. People seem to experience them all the time when they have near-death experiences, or perhaps when they're lucid dreaming or whatever. So then in that case, it just remains for them to access their own culture, to put their own kind of meaning onto it. And aliens, yeah, I mean, you could be carted off by the fairies, or you could be carted off by aliens. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I also think that the idea of not being able to eat the food in fairyland, that there is something. This is one of the most basic ideas that you get in folklore, is essence. And I think it comes from a perfectly natural and evolved tendency for us to be able to perceive an essence that we can't see. You have a sense that if you've touched someone, there's a possibility of contagion from them, and of course that's true, and it's something which has been natural to human beings before we discovered microbes. People wash, even if they didn't have soap or anything like that, they had the ceremonial bit of washing in a font or something like that before they went in for religious ceremonies. I don't literally mean a Christian font there, you shouldn't do that. But do you know what I mean? In a bowl or something, there's a ceremonial washing, which is an idea of getting rid of some intangible essence that you can't actually see, which is unsuitable in a religious place. You can break a spell from a fairy or from a witch by going across running water. There's something about running water that washes away the essence. So the idea that there is a pith to something, I think, comes totally naturally to us, and we've probably been selected for it, because people who don't have a sense of essence live next to their own sewage. So yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff that's in our folklore. It's also natural to human beings.